Hello and welcome back to Suzi's Book Bag, hosted by me, Suzi Fay. If you haven't already become one of our lovely subscribers, please consider doing so now. Just tap the subscribe button and join us every week when I interview interesting authors and people on the publishing scene. This book bag I have behind me is from a lovely bookshop in London, one of the Daunts chain. They're in very beautiful locations and shops. We will be talking quite a bit about bookshops over the next hour or so, but not really the chains, more those dusty little out of the way places that I certainly love. And my guest does too. We'll be talking about so many of my favourite things, actually. Not just dusty bookshops, but dusty books, tracking down mysterious tomes, ghost stories, stories of the occult, weird writers, all my favourite things coming up as I talk to R.B. Russell about his book about his life in books, 50 Forgotten Books. So welcome, Ray. It's fantastic to have you in the book bag.
Hi, Suzi. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, I've been looking forward to this for a long time. I see you've got your own bag behind you. You do have a book bag behind you. What is that about?
It was produced by Dirtro Books probably 10 years ago when they published Studies of Death by Count Stenbock, which is a wonderful decadent 1890s collection of strange stories.
We're into decadence already. We got there in the first few minutes of this chat. We're into decadence and death. It didn't take us very long. So Ray, I can call you Ray. R.B. Russell for the
Please do.
purposes of the jacket, but
Yep.
I can call you Ray. You are not just a writer, you're a publisher, you're a collector, a bibliophile, all these things. Can you tell us a little bit, before we get on to the book, tell us a little bit about Tartarus Press, which is your own imprint?
Tartarus Press was founded in the 1990s purely to get some of Arthur Machen's writings into print. He was my sort of first big literary love. And what started out as a little hobby, very much in the tradition of the old sort of even the alternative and punk zines of the sort of 1980s, cutting and pasting and photocopying and stapling little booklets, kind of got out of hand and ended up becoming a full-time job. I ran out of time to actually earn a proper living.
I get the impression that things running out of hand does sort of happen quite a bit in your life. Maybe collecting too many books, or, well, there's never too many books, is there?
Um, I would never have said that there can't be. Well, a friend of mine who died a little while ago did have too many books. It can get out of hand, and I do actually I do prune my shelves.
Hmm.
But invariably, the moment I prune the shelves, I want that book that's just gone to a secondhand bookshop, and I have to try and buy it back, or the charity shop that they've gone to. So yeah, dangerous thing to do, but it has to be done.
What's the sort of thing you're looking for? With Tartarus Press, you have republished some wonderful classics, including Arthur Machen, but you also find new writers as well. So what's your USP as a publisher?
Um, we've always told people that we publish spooky books because that's the easiest way of explaining sort of supernatural fiction. Um,
Mm.
Certain ghost stories are great, but we also like sort of the strange and the supernatural. Writers like Robert Aikman, who don't quite fit into any tradition. At the end of the day, it's got to be a good read because we have published quite a few authors that don't fit with the idea of being spooky or strange, but
Mm.
it's our enthusiasms. I run it with Rosalie Parker, and it's my partner, and yeah, it's purely books that we like. So every now and again, we'll get very excited and say, "How on earth are we going to sell this to our customers?" And we try to do so purely by our enthusiasm.
What's the model? Do you have subscribers? Do you send out booklets and catalogs and that kind of thing? How does it work?
Over the years, we've tried various things, but in the past, I tried acting like a proper publisher and announcing books several months beforehand, which invariably meant that they never quite got to the printers. What we do now is we decide what we're going to publish. We discuss it with the author, editors, proofreaders. It gets printed. Nobody knows about it, ideally, until the day of publication. These days, we go on social media and we send out emails to customers. But we don't have subscribers. We take a risk with every single book. And luckily, we have lots of lovely customers who are happy to take our recommendation. And, quite often take big risks on books that we think are worth taking risks on.
And they're very beautifully produced. They will last a long time. They're not going to rot like a cheap paperback, are they?
No, I mean, rotting paperbacks do have their place. I've got plenty on my shelves, and I do like. I've just found a copy of The Red Brain by Dashiell Hammett, which it is the smell of decay that is so sweet. It's that. The paper is rotting. It's dying. The book's dying, but it's wonderful. We decided early on that we wanted to make books that we would want to have in our shelves and keep. And it's that question that all presses ask when they start up: who are you going to be selling to, and what do you actually want to produce? So we produce the nicest possible books that we can, that we hope people can still afford. But I go to sort of book fairs occasionally and see sort of private presses that have produced the most wonderful little booklet of Blake's poems on handmade paper, and each bit of type has been carefully sort of hand founded and put in place, and they want sort of £300 for it. And I'm not saying it's not worth it, but I can't afford it, and I'm sure most of our customers can't. So yeah, it's a compromise.
Right, but they often have, little silk ribbons in them, and they're beautifully bound. And you have a house style, don't you? That this kind of cream cover. And where do you get the images for the cover?
Well, the original cream covers were sort of trying to copy the sort of the limited editions of the 1920s and 1930s. Very quickly, we realised we wanted images. So we had a little vignette on the front. I'll grab a book. Is that going to show up? Robert Aikman's Go Back at Once. So we've ended up with this house style with a little vignette image. And it depends what takes our fancy. We've used a number of different artists over time. I hope you can still hear me, because my phone's just gone off.
I think you'll have to stop moving around. It's gone a bit.
Oh no, my phone's done it.
It's gone a bit blank.
Yeah, I don't think I was touching it, but
oh,
aha, I'm back.
You're back, but you've frozen. So
Here we go.
There we go. So I'll ask the question again. Yes, you've come clear again.
Sure.
How do you pick the cover images?
Every book is different. We've used a number of classic illustrations in the past, sort of out of copyright illustrations that seem to fit or go with the original artwork, but we also commission work from various artists. I'm actually, as an art director for Tartarus, I must be quite awful to work for, because I have a very clear idea in my mind what I want, and it's very difficult communicating that to an artist who has their own idea. So I've actually illustrated quite a few of them myself over time. But yeah, that's Stephen Clark, who's a wonderful artist from the Northeast, and he provided the illustrations for all of our Robert Aikman reprints and new editions.
Well, let's talk about Aikman. I first came across his stories in collections of ghost stories or horror stories, and they're not really either ghost stories or horror stories. And when I read them as a kid and as a teen, I never took any notice of names whatsoever. It was just the story, and I would live in the story for the time being. And it was much later that I discovered two of the stories that I absolutely loved and had stayed with me for so long. were by this guy, Robert Aikman, and one was the Inner Room,
Oh yes.
the Doll's House story, which is terrifying, and then the other one is the Trains, which you just can't really classify, but it's they really stick with you. And then after that, I thought I'd better sort of check out this guy, and I think he was. You can pick up a few. I got one paperback. I think it was called The Wine Dark Sea,
Yeah.
with a small pan or picador or something like that. And then I really got the bug with Robert Aikman. How did you find him?
A phone call one day with the musician David Tibet. David just mentioned Robert Aikman, and I had to admit that I knew him as an editor of the Fontana series of ghost stories, but I'd never read him. And David said, "You must." And the next day, I think it was all 8 collections arrived as first editions in a box, special delivery. And Rosalie and I read them, just fell in love with them. And with David, we published a collected edition, crammed all the books into 2 volumes, which was, in retrospect, font size was a little bit challenging. And since then, we've reprinted them all as individual volumes. And I've got to know a few people who knew Aikman, and ended up writing his biography, which was an interesting exercise, it has to be said.
Was he interested in canals?
Oh yes, that was his. He was popularly known for canals. He was the saviour of the inland waterways of Britain, along with a few others. It has to be said, he wasn't the only one. But he set up the Inland Waterways Association, and did very well, frankly. But he always wanted to be a writer. About 20 or 30 years before he ever had anything published on his passport, he had a profession. It was writer. That's what he always wanted to do. And his first book was published with Elizabeth Jane Howard. He knew her very well. In fact, they had a relationship for a while. And he, for a short while, was a literary agent. And he got her first deal with Cape. And then, frankly, the two of them used her name. He sort of piggybacked on her fame to get the two of them published together. An interesting man. I know too much about him these days, which is a bit frightening.
Yes, sometimes you don't need to know too much. But I also remember a canal-based terrifying story. It's called 3 Miles Up or 3 Miles Down,
Yes.
or something like that, written with Elizabeth Jane Howard.
Well, it was actually hers.
Right.
The first collection, the collection they brought out together using her name, was meant to be by the three of them. Sorry, by the two of them, and they had 3 stories each. But they took joint authorship credits. But years later,
So that's actually her.
That is actually her, and it's probably the best story in there, and it's the one that's about canals. Yeah, and it's terrifying.
I think that it's his influence. I mean, I often think you can kind of absorb something from somebody nearby, if you're sensitive enough. Do you have a favourite Aikman story?
It probably was the story Sub Rosa, which is a convoluted sort of framing device, but the idea is that the narrator goes into the house of an older woman, and they're talking about her daughter, and it becomes quite sort of strangely erotic and frightening, and strange animals appear and disappear, and it is wonderfully effective. And then I found out, while doing my research, that it was actually based on a real life incident, which didn't put the main character in a very good light. She fell out with Aikman because she felt that he was describing her. And the whole thing is actually quite painful when you realise that there were real people who had inspired this story.
I'd probably go, well, I can't narrow it down, but the Cicerones is incredible. And there's another one, I can't remember the name of it, but it's about taking a gondola ride in Venice.
Oh, yes, Never Visit Venice. Yeah.
That's right. Never visit Venice, and you won't want to after reading that story. Yeah, I think he's absolutely terrific, and probably due to the efforts of people like you. I think Mark Gatiss is a fan as well. I think Jeremy Dyson is a fan from League of Gentlemen. So he's not going away. Let's get on to the book. I've got a proof copy. It's not published by yourself, is it? It's published
No, no,
by
it's very nice publishers in Sheffield called And Other Stories.
And Other Stories. Yeah, yeah. So it's not really. It's a bit of a misnomer, and it sounds a bit from the book like they almost expected you to write something different.
In some ways, they did. In fact, what they asked originally was a memoir of my time going around secondhand bookshops and jumble sales of the world, finding rare books. We very quickly altered that because, frankly, yes, I've found some rare books over the years and some lovely books, but they aren't always the most interesting ones or have the most interesting stories attached to them. I mean, I've got a lovely first edition of Brideshead Revisited, um, which is a book that has meant a lot to me over the years. But for a start, I bought it online. I can't remember who I bought it from.
Mm.
And there's nothing much that I can say that other people haven't said already. So the idea was to find books that people wouldn't necessarily know that well, might not have heard of, because that's kind of where a lot of my interest lies. I love the classics and I read the classics, but those unloved and unwanted books, which really deserve to be brought back into print, are much more interesting to talk
At the same time, not everyone is a rave. You are quite critical of some of the writers.
Yeah, I mean, some of them, I start off talking about Colin Wilson's The Outsider.
Yeah,
That's the edition that I bought, which I absolutely adored in the 1980s when I bought it. I think it was 14 when I bought it.
perfect
I
age.
I don't think it quite stands the test of time, but it does recommend some fascinating books to go and read for
Mm.
yourself. It was a wonderful reading list. Um, so yeah, but some books have, I mean, some books are problematic. Some authors are problematic. Um, you know, over the sort of 30 or 40 years I've been reading, some of them are very awkward. I was a big fan of M.P. Shiel. In fact, I still think
Mm.
that M.P. Shiel is a great writer, a wonderful decadent writer of the 1890s. Knew Arthur Machen. Should have realised something was wrong because Machen didn't like him. Didn't go out of his
And
way, but
Machen was a genial guy, wasn't he?
he was. And in print, there were a few words exchanged. And I think to the literary researcher John Galsworth, Machen said that Shiel's word wasn't to be trusted. Now a lot of his books, there was a lot of yellow peril rubbish, but his
Mm.
decadent fiction is great. But he also wrote a book called The Purple Cloud, which is great. It's probably one of the first books about the last person on Earth
Mm.
after a disaster. Lots of people copy the idea after Shiel. But Shiel, we've recently discovered, was actually a convicted paedophile. We've only just discovered this. And at the end of The
Mm.
Purple Cloud, he discovers a new Eve, a young girl he's going to repopulate the planet with. And it's kind of a book you want to drop like a hot brick suddenly, which is a real
Mm.
shame. Um, Not sure how much it devalues his other work, but it doesn't help. It has to be said.
And the book is a paean of prose. I never know how to pronounce that word. To these lovely dusty little bookshops that you can find all over the place. What has happened to that world with the advent of the internet? I mean, it used to be such a great joy, didn't it, to go somewhere and see if you could find a treasure, and now you feel like everything's on a books or something.
Um, One can't complain too much because I found some great things online, but you lose the history that you are meant to have with a book. Um, Before COVID, people complained that there were no secondhand bookshops. And in fact, a friend of ours, a literary researcher and writer, Mark Valentine,
Mm.
did some research and has found that there was there were as many bookshops pre-COVID, in those few years before COVID, as there were in the 1980s, which we both remember as being the heyday of the second-hand bookshop.
Mm.
Comparing the bookshops available in Drift's guides in the 1980s. So it's one of those things that we tend to look back and remember. You know, I remember Brighton with a great deal of affection, because there were 10 different bookshops I used to visit. They weren't all there concurrently. Maybe at any one time there were only actually 5 or 6, but you kind of forget that. Sadly, York is our nearest place for bookshops, and we've lost several bookshops there recently. So I hope things aren't going downhill suddenly. But there are still bookshops out there, and there are some wonderful characters still running bookshops. And yeah, with mad overflowing stock that they should really pruned themselves, and with strange characters. Yeah.
What's still on your wish list?
I have to be honest and say most of the books that I really want, I have got an edition of. I tend to like these days finding association copies. So if I'm sort of feeling like I need to buy a book, I do try and sort of rein myself in, because at some point something wonderful will be offered, and I'm trying to be a bit more careful with what I buy these days, because there's not much you can't actually get, and that hasn't been reprinted, or there aren't cheaper copies of. So yeah, there's still a few first editions I'd like. One day I'll find Arthur Macken's very first publication, Eleusinian. There probably were only 3 or 4 copies out there in real life, even though 100 were printed. But I think they're all accounted for in libraries, university libraries in the States.
So you're very keen on Machen, and how did you come across him first of all? Was it The Hill of Dreams?
It was, and it was a very strange bookseller in Brighton called Noel Brooks, who was fed up with me going around. I used to carry this around in my pocket and say, "Oh, have you got anything by?" And one day he gave me a paperback of The Hill of Dreams, the Corgi edition, and said, "Here, take that." And I assumed it was an existentialist text, and I read it as such and loved it, because the language was so amazing. I must have reread it 6 or 7 times over the years, and every time I read it, I find something different in the writing. It's always beautifully written, but it's a book that can be interpreted in a number of different ways.
I like it when the opening bit in Carlion in Wales, where he came from, is fantastic, and the evocation of ancient Rome kind of underlying the contemporary society is really stunning and very, very decadent. But the last time I read it, I loved the evocation of West London. The character goes to live somewhere sort of roundabout Shepherd's Bush when it's in a period of change in the Victorian era, and all the houses that are now there are being built over fields and farms. And I found that quite extraordinary. What came to you from your last reading? Different things pop out at different times, I think.
Yeah, well, I first read him when I was living in the countryside. And although I appreciated the countryside writing, it was the city, his evocation of London, that I was fascinated by. And then I went to Sheffield University and reading it in Sheffield, and I was missing the countryside. And suddenly all that description of the hidden lanes and the woods and the valleys of the Saul Valley, which Machen sort of evokes, suddenly all came to life for me. And I think I also initially thought of him as being sort of the great artist, the great doomed artist, the main character who's trying to write a novel, which at the very end, not really a spoiler, someone opens up and looks at it and says it was all gibberish. Now, we don't know whether he meant that they just weren't clever enough to understand it, or maybe he was absolutely mad and was writing gibberish. Since then, I've realized that he's not just this doomed artist. I don't know, it is a book that you can interpret in different ways depending on where you are in your own life. Various books have been like that with me. I mean, I absolutely adored Raymond Radiguet's The Devil in the Flesh, and thought the hero was wonderful when I was about 15. And I read it a few years ago and thought, what an appalling person. how was he a hero? One's sympathies change, which I find quite hard, because essentially I think I'm still 15 with my love of books. And to find that I wasn't entirely correct about everything at 15 is quite painful, but something we all have to learn, I suppose. It's just taken me a long time to learn.
It could be the portrait. The Hill of Dreams could be the portrait of someone who just isn't a good fit for the world. And the world is, I mean, one element is the world is too Philistine to understand him. You could read it like that.
Yeah, and I think that was Macken's intention. He appreciated art. He was a strange character. I mean, he was very Christian, high church Anglican, but hated preaching and hated Rome. He had this idea that there was a residual, strange, historic Welsh church that may well have existed, and he was trying to sort of tap back into that. And yet, most people I know who read and appreciate Macken aren't Christians, but appreciate the mysticism, I think. His general worldview is quite open.
Well, I've brought one of my own Mackens to show you. So this is London, Martin Secker, 1925. Terribly battered book jacket, but it's a beautiful blue, whatever you call it, cover. So that's pretty nice. And it is signed. It's the first edition, and I have the signature right here. Can you see that? Yeah. So it says, this edition is limited to 250 numbered copies, signed by the author, of which this is number 22, Arthur Machen. And it's beautiful paper, very crinkled at the ends. And I when I took it down from the shelf, I almost feel like I've slightly ripped the dust jacket just by taking it off the shelf. It's very fragile. And I found a bookmark in the middle of The Secret of the Sangreal. That's sort of as obviously as far as I've got, because, you know, I'm sure I'm ripping this dust jacket to pieces. But what happened with this is I got this from a little a bookshop that I was just passing through on the way to somewhere else, some little town somewhere, and I went to a bookshop and found it, and it does have wormholes through it. And the chap sort of sighed deeply and said, "Oh dear, you know, it's in such a state, you can have it for £10," which really seemed like a steal, I have to say. Yeah. So that's how I got my signed Machen. I mean, it's actually disintegrating as we speak.
The thing about that book is that book has a place in my heart, because I had exactly the same edition as my first signed Machen.
We've both got a signed Machen.
That design actually inspired the Tartarus Press design. I mean, it's evolved over the years. We don't have the frame anymore, but we have the frame, and I pinched the design of that jacket for the early Tartarus books. So yeah, it's an important part of our evolution as a publisher.
And of course, the other thing is that the next time I went to the town, I couldn't find the bookshop. You know, it was as if it had never been. Yeah, exactly. Do you have anything else to show? Any more show and tell?
Oh, show and tell. Well, I'll show you two Machens if I can find them. This is the pride of my collection, really. It's Macken's The Great God Pan. And,
yes.
Oh no. My
How old
picture's
is
gone
that?
again. Are we still there?
Yes, I can see you. How old is that then?
1890s.
Oh.
Yeah, I can't see you. You've disappeared, and I'm worried you'll disappear. But it belongs. So yeah, this is The Great God Pan and The Inmost Light by Arthur Machen from the 1890s. and it belonged to his friend A.E. Waite. Not sure how easily you can see that inscription. And I have about 9 books now that were from Waite's library. It's taken me 20 years to collect them together. So that is a great treasure. I'd also like to show you, this is one volume from the Chilean edition of Arthur Machen's works. It was a gift from a friend. It's absolutely knackered. It's got all kinds of labels from various libraries. It came from the borough of Accrington. It's got some wonderful stamps in it, of various different colours and sizes and shapes. And perforations and notes from readers. I wouldn't part with that for the world. It doesn't have much value, but it's got a history, a proper history. And I think that's one of the things I'm starting to collect now, books with stories.
So just say a little about the significance of A.E. Waite. He's a very interesting character of the Deck and the Deer, and a friend of Yeats, I believe.
Yeah, he was a member of the Occult Order of the Golden Dawn, and he wrote fairly interminably huge books on the occult. He and Machen didn't agree on a great deal, I don't think, but they were both interested in the same subjects. And together they wrote a very rare book, The House of the Hidden Light, which is a series of letters between the two of them, which is basically the two of them talking about women wandering around London in the evening. They obviously shared this sense of humour and an interest in all matters to do with the occult. He's very important in sort of occult circles, but a million miles away from Machen. Machen's a great prose stylist and loved telling stories.
But
I think
A.E. Waite was involved in the Rider-Waite tarot pack. I think that's probably his greatest claim to fame.
Yeah.
But
the
not as a great writer.
No.
Okay, so I'll show another book. I don't know about its value actually, but I wouldn't part with this for the world, and it took me a long time to find it. This is letters. This is volume 2 of Shelley's letters. So this is everything from Italy. So 1818 to his death in 1822. And again, I think it comes from the library of, it's got a, store withdrawn from the library. It's still got its little ticket in it. So nobody was particularly interested in this book. And it's very rare. I mean, ex-library copies are not generally valuable, but I suggested the letters, which are not as famous as Keats's letters. You can get so many editions of Keats's letters, and these are just not reprinted, and I think they're fantastic. And I suggested it to Backlisted Pod, and they, the podcast Backlisted, and they didn't want to do it because they're just not available. Apparently, the books have to be available in some form or other. But I have a great story behind it, which is that I started reading them probably about 2019. I mean, I've read them many times, but I started to read them 200 years to the day from when they were written, which is very strange. You feel like you're living in 2 time frames simultaneously. It's really peculiar. And you also, but you don't know what's going to happen next. Everything feels very, very fresh. And I was lying in bed one night and looking up at a bookcase, and there was a piece of paper sticking sort of right out. And I thought, well, that's a bit strange. I don't know what that's doing there. How come I haven't spotted that before? I got up and pulled it out, and it was a press release about the discovery of an unknown Shelley letter in some archive somewhere. And without a word of a lie, it fitted into that precise moment in the, it was the missing letter, exactly at the point at which I had got up to in this sort of 200-year time slip thing. So I'm not sure what I did with it. I didn't put it in, but I read it in the proper place and thought, wow, how incredible. But I just opened it at random. So here's one from Marlow, July the 13th, 1817. Dear Sir, he's writing to his publisher, who's also a bookseller. Be so obliging as to send me immediately Sibylline Leaves by S.T. Coleridge. I should receive it the same night if on receipt of this you would have the goodness to send, wherever it is published, and direct the messenger to take it to the Marlow coach office before he returns. Dear Sir, your very obedient servant, Percy B. Shelley. I kind of like that. That's about book collecting as well.
Yeah. So do you remember where you got the book?
Yes, it was Hay, and I used to go to Hay. One of the bigger, probably, is it Booth's Books? But no, it was one of the smaller ones on the main street. And I went for years and years and years and years, and that was always the book that I wanted to get, and volume one. And of course, it's the way I got two. I got 2 copies of volume one, and then I finally got this. And I think a Shelleyan had probably died because there were about 6 books that just all suddenly appeared. Probably bought the lot of them. But I mean, those are, you can't quite get the thrill of that from looking online, can you?
No, not at all. No, I think,
and I think they cost something like £20 for 2 volumes as well. So not expensive at all.
No, it's one of the things about having written 50 Forgotten Books. I've had quite a few people write to me saying, I've had exactly the same experiences, but with different books in different bookshops. But the books that mean most to you, you remember who you were with when you bought them, and why you were there, or who recommended the book to you, or where you were when you finally got around to reading it. Sort of, it's been on your to be read pile for the last 10 years. It's not, the text is obviously of paramount importance, but there's so much else that we bring to a text in terms of not just the actual edition and how it's bound or what it looks like, but all those intangible personal things that end up becoming part of your own history. I look around my shelves and it's like an aid memoir. I don't actually keep a proper diary, but I do know where I was and who I was with when I bought certain books. I assume you're the
also
same.
Books can come with little like bus tickets in them, or extraordinary little dedications, and some of the dedications are quite poignant, aren't they? You wonder why the book has been disposed of.
My copy of Devil in the Flesh has got a postcard in it, which is great, and I've always assumed that that's where everything was set. And it was only when I was writing 50 Forgotten Books I bothered to Google them. I mean, obviously I didn't have Google in the 1980s. Absolutely nothing to do with the book whatsoever, but in my mind it has to be kept in that book.
So let's have a look at some of the different titles in the book. So we've talked about Machen, Alistair Crowley. That's an interesting one. I mean, again, somebody with a kind of rebarbative writing style, but definitely an intriguing and interesting guy. People really collect Crowleyana, don't they? I mean, I imagine he's very expensive to collect these days.
I'm afraid so. He was obviously a man of massive talent and massive ability and energy. It's just whether you agree that he was directed in the right way. But I think his fiction is worth reading. His short stories are always interesting. I first read his novel Moonchild. There were Sphere paperbacks in the 1980s of these things. The Diary of a Drug Fiend, I think, is a really interesting book. I mean, he really could write when he put his mind to it. It's just that the occult, it's one of those things. When he's writing his occult books, he's writing in jargon for those who understand. They're not for the rest of us, unfortunately. But yeah, fascinating character. And I would recommend Phil Baker's recent book. I know some Crowleyantes think that it's a bit sensational. He's not always entirely correct about certain minor details, but it's about the city and the beast, sort of Crowley in London, and it is remarkable reading.
He's also written a really good biography of Austin Osman Spare, hasn't he? I think that's Phil. It's really, really interesting. Yeah, he came and gave a talk at the Authors Club about it. I mean, this is another theme of your book, really, the friends that you have gathered around you and the
Mm.
like-minded people that you've gathered around you over the years, who've really formed part of the Tartarus family in a way. So, I mean, one being Mark Valentine. So, tell us about him.
Well, um, back in the late 80s, I went to I think it was the first proper meeting of the old Arthur Machen Society. And I was a student, I had no money, and I met a group of people. There were probably 20 people there, and I'm still good friends with most of them.
Mm.
Quite a few of them, yeah, there's no lie, it did change my life. Mark Valentine and a friend of his became a friend of mine, Roger Dobson, who's no longer with us, persuaded me that I should start publishing, that I should do a guide to Macken's pubs, and that was my first publication. And Mark's remained a friend ever since, and we publish his fiction, his essays. He's a short story writer and a poet. He's a very, very fine poet. And he's edited books for us and made many recommendations. Yes, we saw Mark only yesterday. We went around the bookshops of York with a few other friends. Yeah, these things are important. And it was just this one meeting, one weekend in Killeen, when I met various friends like John Priest, who gave me the Killeen edition. Yeah, it's one of those things that people around books tend to be decent people.
In many cases, and in some cases not. I mean, people around literary societies you've had some interesting experiences with running kind of fan clubs, and I think it sounds like you've had a bit of trouble with literary estates as well. Literary estates are
Yeah,
a curious thing, aren't they?
estates. One example I'll give is the writer Sarban, wonderful writer. We couldn't find his literary estate. Various researchers had tried finding who held the rights, and eventually we published, I think it was The Dollmaker by Sarban. We just did 200 copies with a note in the front saying, if anyone knows where the estate lies, please let us know. And I had a phone call 2 or 3 days after it was published from a woman saying, you don't know who I am, do you? And I had to say, no. And she said, you're looking for Sarban's estate. I am his daughter, and you've published without permission. And I said, we have. What we were trying to do was flush you out. We would love to publish more of your father's work. He was a great writer. And she said, gosh, wasn't he? And we became great friends. And she gave us permission to publish his other books. And we went and stayed with her on a number of occasions and got on like a house on fire. And she unearthed all kinds of material which no one had ever seen before. And that's what you want from estates. Others have other agendas. And I have come across a few who really don't seem to want the author that they are representing to actually be published. And unfortunately, there's not much you can do about that.
Until they move on,
yeah.
or things come out of copyright.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah. I'm saying, unfortunately, most of the writers that I'm really interested in will remain in copyright for another sort of 20 years. But yeah, on the whole, we've not really had many problems with estates. Most estates really do want to see their authors in print, and will go out of their way to do that, especially if you're a small press as well. Some have been incredibly generous and sort of waived fees and things like that. So I can't complain at all. But literary societies, one of those things, the sort of people who set up literary societies are very strange, and I've set up a few myself. It's a great way of meeting other people who like the same author and obtaining books and information. The Arthur Machen Society has now become the Friends of Arthur Machen because there was a big bust up about 25 years ago. But it was great. I got to know Arthur Machen's daughter. She was incredibly generous with her time and her memories and her books. It's Yeah, it's one of those things. I never thought that I would be a member of clubs. I never thought that I wanted to join clubs and societies, but it's worth doing.
Mm. And your love of Sylvia Townsend Warner comes
Mm.
across in several of the essays in the book. Again, she's not exactly forgotten, and I think Virago have republished some of her books in the past. But what was it about her that really appealed? I mean, what is it about a writer that appeals to you anyway? Is it the great backstory? Do they absolutely have to have a brilliant writing style, or a kind of combination? What's the thing that appeals to you?
I'd love to say it's entirely about the writing, but it's not. The backstory is interesting.
Mm.
Most writers spend all their time sitting at their typewriter, not doing much. But Sylvia Townsend Warner had a very interesting life. And I first came across her through the Arthur Machen connection because Arthur was her uncle by marriage. And Claire Harmon came to the old Machen Society to talk about Sylvia. And I bought her biography of Sylvia Townsend Warner, which is very, very good. And I didn't quite become obsessed, but I really wanted to know more about her. And the writing was as good as I wanted it to be. And she is a
Mm.
fascinating writer, led a fascinating life. Um, Her views and opinions were, uh, no, I'm a lefty, and she was very much a lefty, although she did venerate Uncle Joe Stalin perhaps longer than she should have done.
Mm.
Um, but the life invariably informs the writing. I don't see how the kind of people who I've got a friend who interrogates texts but does not want to know anything about the author, which strikes me as leaving half of the story off the page. I mean, authors always write with intention and with their own history and their own biases, and that's equally as interesting as the fiction.
It seems to me also that you're very interested in place and how writers write about place, which is interesting because a lot of the writers that we've been talking about, they're so heavily infused with imagination that the places can be sort of just tantalizing out of reach, can't they?
Uh, yes, we've recently found that very awkward because with Mark Valentine, myself, and Rosalie Parker, we and a few other friends, we tried producing a gazetteer of real, sorry, of literary ghost stories, unlike the sort of gazetteers of real ghost stories you used to find in the 1970s, where you would go to Leeds Castle and there'd be a lady in grey that's meant to be seen in the roof. Very, very boring stories. We wanted to send people to where proper, interesting, well-written literary ghost stories have been set. So fans of Arthur Mack can go to various sites in Calais, in Gwent, in London, and know where he was setting his stories. But frustratingly, there's quite a few authors we had to leave out because they didn't base their stories on any real place. They used their imagination, which
Mm.
we found incredibly frustrating. So there are certain ghost story writers we just couldn't include because they never told us where they were setting their stories. It's always Dashshire, or they've made up a town that doesn't actually exist. But yeah, absolutely fascinating seeing where these stories are set sometimes.
I always liked Lost Hearts by M.R. James, and again, you feel like you could walk into the house that he describes in that. And he's Mr. Abney, which I always thought he might have got from Abney Park Cemetery in Stoke Newington. Quite a spooky place. But yeah, you feel as if you could walk into that house and catch the evil owner up to something, doing something wicked in the library, don't you?
And if you know the right people, when it comes to M.R. James, then someone like Rosemary Pardo has devoted her whole life to James, and she knows exactly which stories are set in which real houses. She's done her
Mm.
sleuthing, um, which I think is a joyful thing to do. I mean, it's minor literary criticism in terms of there are people out there doing wonderful things with Henry James or going through the works of Virginia Woolf, but to devote your whole life to a minor writer that only a few people read, I think that's proper dedication. That's proper love of the author and literature.
So you're at the end of the book, I think your selection of authors and your selection of books is very personal, and it kind of has to be. It has to be. It's a particular place in a particular time in a particular person, and it's not for everybody. You know, I think everybody could come up with their own 50 books, but right at the end, you kind of say, look, there's a narrowness to the books that have been chosen, but that's kind of inevitable, isn't it?
It is, and it's also more difficult to choose books when they're. It's like anything in life. That which is further away, you've spent enough time thinking about, and you've sort of winnowed it down to the really important ones. It's very difficult to think about which were the most important books to you of the last sort of 5 or 10 years. Will they stand the test of time? And one tends to be enthusiastic about things you've read quite recently. I hope that some of those later books I will still be as enthusiastic about in 10 years' time. I think I will be. I mean, my big problem was all the books I had to leave out. There were lots of books I wanted to put in there, but having decided that 50 forgotten books sounded right, I couldn't really make it 60 books.
Well, name one that you missed out that you rather regret.
I don't know if I can name just one.
I'll let you have a couple.
I don't know, because it would be unfair, I think, because there are quite a few contemporary authors. I mean, I've included Rebecca Lloyd. Her Child Cephalina is a wonderful book. I've cheated slightly. Tartarus published it. I just think she's a great writer, and I would have included more by her. Her Zagava book, and The Bellboy. But if she had been in there, someone else would have been moved out. I did spend quite a lot of time with long lists, moving people in and out of my list of 50 books. So I think, it would be unfair to sort of start throwing people out and adding people to the list at this point.
It's quite a good parlor game anyway, isn't it? Who you would include and who you wouldn't include, and there's always going to be somebody who misses out that you end up regretting. But I just wanted to. You seem. Sorry.
No, I can't. No, go on. Carry on.
You seem to be a bit of a Renaissance man. So I wanted to just sort of wind up by talking about composing music. And I did dig out this, which is the CD, which presumably, I mean, I was a literary editor, and an awful lot of things just stuck to my fingers over those years. So I don't know if I was sent this, but this, and I've been listening to it this morning. Very, very nice, dreamy music with a beautiful female vocalist.
Yeah.
And this accompanies. It's called Ghosts, and it accompanies your short story collection called Ghosts. Does it?
Yes, it's sort of associated with it. I don't know if I'm a Renaissance man. I'm a dabbler. I enjoy playing around with all kinds of things, and music was one of those things. As a teenager, I still can't play any instrument with any great proficiency, but I discovered that I can compose music, and I love doing that. I can't play anything live, and yeah, it's just, again, one of those things. It's a bit like writing. I've always written, but it wasn't until I was 40 that I thought, right, I'm going to have to get down. And I started writing some short stories and novels, and at the same time, I thought, right, I need to get the music out of my system as well. So yeah, it's all sort of come flooding out in the last few years. And been good fun.
So this is a collaboration. These are your compositions, and the lyrics are yours.
In that particular. I think one of those might be Lidvine herself, her lyrics. But yes, we came across each other online, and she provided some of the vocals, which are rather wonderful, and lifted and completely changed the songs. It was the early days of the internet, when you could go on MySpace and places like that. And, social media was a great thing. Didn't quite have the pitfalls and problems that it does these days.
Yeah. What are you writing at the moment? Are you writing at the moment?
I'm kind of stuck in the middle of a novel. And I'm not quite sure how to end it. I need to know where it's going. But I've usually got something on the go. There's always some writing. I have learned to take my time over these things now. It's one of those things about having a few things under your belt. You do realize you don't have to immediately find a publisher, and I can spend more time working, honing things, which I was always too impatient in the past. So there will be more books, hopefully. I've got some very kind.
Well, I think this is something that does come out quite strongly with the quite. I think we can say the writers in this they're sort of eccentric. They're on their own path. That's the thing that they've got in common. They might not be the greatest writers, but they're very original and fascinating characters, and they're not part of that publishing treadmill. There are people who write a little and then stop, or write very infrequently, and there's something about the creativity of these people that can't really be trammeled. I mean, I think Machen was pretty prolific, but the modern publishing world does seem to be saying, can we have more just like the stuff you've already done that goes down so well? And there are some people that are never going to fit into that template.
Yeah, I think I've been lucky in some respects in that, although I've thought in my own writing to have a big readership, not having I've never been offered a proper 5-book contract to write, and I'm really pleased because I do know writers who have got that contract and have been really they've given up their day job to write, and all the fun's gone out of it because of the pressure to actually produce. And some of them have still produced great work, but haven't found it easy, and others have found the pressure too much for them. A lot of the writers there in 50 Forgotten Books, although some of them were professional writers, quite a few of them are, they were driven. They had to write. It wasn't anything about the money or the publishing contract or what their publishers wanted next. So I think it's one of the great strengths of being sort of on the edge, not being part of the mainstream. There's a lot to be said for it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I will wind up by asking my 3 questions that I'm asking everybody. And the first one is, favorite book is much too hard. So what is your favorite artwork? Do you have one?
It's got to be Harry Clarke's illustrated Edgar Allan Poe, which I had the Cheap and Nasty Octopus Books edition when I was a teenager, and I always wanted to upgrade, and then finally I got, this isn't the first edition, this is the later expanded edition. Harry Clarke's illustrations of Poe, just wonderful, wonderfully weird and beautiful and decadent. So yeah, it's going to be Harry Clarke's Poe.
Now I sort of feel like you've read everything or almost everything you want to read, but what is there a book that you feel like, gosh, I should have read that by now, and you haven't got around to?
Well, I used to produce the guide to first edition prices. We did about 8 editions, and I know the titles of so many books that I've never read. The one I would show you, I've just removed from the shelves, and we've sold a very long run, those nice little blue jacket editions of Proust, In Search of Lost Time. Must have been 20 of them sitting there, and I've always meant to get round to reading them. And I finally admitted to myself that I'm not going to get round to reading it. I know I should, but if I read that, there are 20 other novels I don't read. So I am ashamed of the fact that I got rid of it. And it's been in the house for the last 30 years. But I've been honest with myself and realistic. But I am ashamed, yes, I should have read it.
Well, there's a lovely point in the book. I mean, all of us who have lots and lots and lots of books and still can't stop buying more know that we can never read them all. but you know, it's all potential fun that's on the shelves. You know, we don't need to feel too guilty that we are not going to read all these books.
Well,
But I
exactly. If you
think
go into
Priest has
someone's
been
house
mentioned before.
well,
Sorry.
if you walk into someone's house and if you walk into someone's house and look at their bookshelves, as most book lovers do, and you judge people by their books, and you say, "Have you read all of these?" If someone says yes, well, where's the fun in that? There's nothing new to discover. You should definitely have books on your shelves you haven't read, because you don't know when you might want to read them.
If they're on the shelves and you've read them, then they are just there for show, really.
No, I
You
would say
know,
that they're there to go back to. I mean, that's why I started collecting books. I got books from the library as a child, and then I had to give them back. Um, and what I discovered was that you only have to pick up a book off a shelf and read half a page, and you're back in the whole book. The whole experience is there for you to relive. So books that I've read, 20 years ago, I can pick off the shelf and read just a page and put it back, and that's it. I've had that hit in a very easy way.
and finally, the last question is, what kind of weird and wonderful feedback have you had, either about Tartarus Press as a venture or about your own work? Has anybody said anything particularly strange or funny about your work?
Well, there's a book dealer called Ben Bass. I haven't seen Ben for years. He always used to come along with paperbacks by Ray Russell, the author of Incubus, I think it was, and say, "Would you sign your book?" And he knew it wasn't me. The other Ray Russell is 40 years older than me and is now dead, but he thought it was a great joke. So one day I just took it off him and I signed it and gave it back to him, which I don't think he wanted me to do, really. But the strangest thing recently was with 50 Forgotten Books. I went to a book fair and I won't name the book dealer, who's been a friend for years. And he asked me what I've been up to recently. And I said, "Oh, I just published my memoirs." And he frowned and immediately said, "You?" Which I thought was hilarious. But no, I won't name it. It's not fair.
he didn't think you'd have anything worth writing about,
Worth saying,
or
no.
Somebody who just sits around in a chair all day reading, or
Exactly.
He's not up to
Which is all I've
speed.
written. That's all I've written. Is sitting around reading books.
Everybody's writing memoirs nowadays. I mean, the trend is now not that you have to have this enormous life or huge experiences. Quieter memoirs, and I think it's part of the idea that so I'll just say, I think now there is a trend for memoirs they're kind of more inclusive in a way, that everybody's story is interesting. You don't need to be this sort of famous or privileged person to write a memoir. And I think your way of writing a memoir via books that you have loved and shops that you have loved and crazy booksellers that you have known in this, this wonderful world of bibliophilia that we are part of. I think it's a really nice way of telling your story. It will delight book lovers everywhere, I'm sure. I was particularly pleased. There is a stray reference to Christopher Fowler, a really dear friend of mine, and you met him somewhere and said what good fun he was, and I totally agree. So yeah, well done. I think it's a terrific book, and I hope very much that your novel comes along splendidly in due course.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining me in the book bag.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody who's chosen to watch. I hope you'll all rush off, look at your shelves, pick down those volumes that maybe you've been meaning to read. And if you need any prompts, especially for writing of decadence, doom, darkness, and death, I would recommend the 50 Forgotten Books. They definitely don't deserve to be forgotten. So thank you for watching, and please join me next time in the book bag. Bye.